The next session this morning is a panel discussion. And the panel discussion is going to be on lessons learned in food system impact evaluation. And it is going to be chaired by the great, did you hear that? The great Jeff Leroy.
If I can have the panel members come up to the podium. If you don't know who you are, then probably you shouldn't be on the panel. All right, good morning, everybody. My name is Chef Leroy. I'll be moderating this panel on food systems, impact evaluations in food systems. This is the morning of the conference when you realize that you're not 25 years old anymore and regret that you didn't realize that last night. So get up and get some oxygen in the system. Come on, you don't need to talk to your neighbor. Get up, everybody, stretch, because it's an hour and 20 minutes they paid me for, and I plan to go all the way to the end. All right, stretch, yes, good. So the objective of today's session is to think about evaluation studies, and mostly about randomized trials. And there is, when you read papers and when you talk to colleagues, there is quite a bit of uncertainty around that very tool that we use, the randomized trials and impact evaluation. So the objective is really to identify some of the challenges that we have. So somewhat uncommon, this panel discussion is not about what we know, it's about what we do not know, okay? So this is not a discussion to or a panel to show off their knowledge. It's mostly to be kind of collectively modest and see what we need to learn in the future. Okay, so how will we do this? There is kind of 4 groups here. We first of all have the panel members. You can see them already, but I'll introduce them in a second. There's the audience, that's you, and you may want to get your phones out because we're going to ask you to participate in this panel. There's 3 listeners in the audience. Those are people who will everybody will pay attention, but they will pay very careful attention. And I've asked them to kind of talk about one salient point at the end of the panel they've heard. So those are Ed Frangillo. Can you raise your hand, Ed? That's Ed. And then Will Masters is behind Ed. And then Alan Dangor is right there. Okay, so at the very end, they'll kind of get the mic for a minute and raise one point that they thought stood out. Oh, and then there's me. And I want to start this panel with a bit of background because it's important to kind of define what we want to do. So often in this field, we wonder when we do a program what the impact is. And as simple as that sounds, what is impact? It's basically, if you look at a program, imagine that you give cows to households. You want to know, and the outcome you're interested in is nutrition of children. You want to know what is the nutritional status of that child that had the program, and what's the difference with the nutritional status of the child that didn't have the program. So whether you like, either you can look at the equation or you look at the little graphic, that's what impact evaluation is about. It's very simple. But the challenge in impact evaluation is obviously that you can never have the same child both in the program and not in the program. That's impossible, right? You're either in or out. So that really leads to the challenge of impact evaluation, where we need a counterfactual. We need to know what would have happened to the child if it had not been receiving the benefits of the program. That's what this is all about. Now, we found solutions to that. What we do, rather than getting frustrated that any person cannot be at the same time treated and not treated, or receiving and not receiving, we use what we call randomized trials. And just pay attention to this amazing animation. So we flip a coin, we decide which kids, oops, this one kid. This worked really well in my room, so I didn't mean to exclude this child. This child was in the right box, I swear. This could be called attrition, that's another challenge. So we flip a coin, we decide who receives and does not receive the program. And why do we do this? Because this is called, obviously, an experimental design. And why do we do this? Because if done well, and I put if in bold because there's many ways of not doing this well, but if you do this well, the idea is that both groups, the ones who receive and not receive, are comparable. That means that the only difference that remains between those two groups is the treatment or the intervention or the program you're giving them. And that way, the control group gives you a valid counterfactual. So you can start making comparisons and drawing conclusions. Experimental designs are not always feasible. They're often challenging. They often require creative thinking. And if it's not possible, we often use quasi-experimental designs, and I've listed some of those designs there. Now, there's a lot of discussion about using or not using experimental designs. I just want to point out very quickly that they have advantages, and using before or after or with and without designs have limitations. This was a study we did in Burundi. It was a randomized design. You see the green line is a treatment group. You see the stunting rates in that group at baseline and follow-up were about 64%. So the treatment group stayed stable, and in the control group you see that there was an increase because things were getting worse in the country while we were doing this study. When we do the statistics, we find an impact of 5.5 percentage point reduction in stunting. Now let's assume for a second that we had used a before and after design, right? So no randomization, we just have a before and after design. That we would have concluded under this scenario that the impact was 0.2 percentage points, because with a before and after you don't have a control, and clearly we would have drawn the wrong conclusion, right? And the other scenario, if you do a with and without design, so you don't do a baseline, you just look at what happens in the treatment and the control at the end of your program, and under this scenario we would have concluded that the impact was 10.5 percentage points. Just to show you that using randomized trials has a lot of advantages, because you can kind of avoid, if you do them well, all of these wrong conclusions. Okay, so what this panel is not about is we're not discussing the utility of RCTs. That's an interesting discussion, but it's not a discussion we want to have in this very room. What we want to do is identify where all of us need better guidance on the proper use of RCTs. Okay? So, going to my next card here, this is the moment where I introduce the panel members. Well, they will actually do the work themselves. So I want to ask everybody on the panel, they prepared some name cards, but they're not there, right? So, Shibani, you're the first. So I want everybody to just very quickly say something about, you can say who you are, and then your background, your field of work, and your experience with conducting trials.
Thank you, Jeff, and good morning, everybody. I'm Shivani Kosh. I am a research associate professor at Tufts University, Friedman School. I have a background in biochemistry and nutrition science, but during my PhD years, I've focused a lot on applied nutrition and drifted into global nutrition very by chance and public health nutrition. So I'm kind of working across the space of going from biochemistry to applied sciences, and I have some experience with RCTs working in the space of assessment of nutritional interventions that are focused on efficacy and effectiveness, and some experience in using quasi-experimental designs for evaluating programmatic interventions. So I'm going to say some, and I'm going to leave it at that, and I'll pass it on to Grace.
Okay, Grace, same questions for you.
Good morning, everyone. Grace Marquis from McGill University. I work on maternal and child nutrition for the last 30 years or so out in the communities in rural, specifically now in rural Ghana. With this question, I kind of went back and started counting up the number of trials. So I've done quite a few of them, or I've been involved with them as a member of a team, including randomized trials that have done the randomization at the individual level, and more frequently at some cluster level, as well as doing a large quasi-experimental trial.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Agnes Kisumbing. I'm a senior research fellow at the International Food Policy Research Institute, IFPRI. I'm an economist. And my experience with RCTs and quasi-experimental methods has often been when I get dragged onto a project because they have forgotten to look at gender. And they say, how am I going to look at gender in the context of this evaluation I'm doing, and it hasn't been designed to do so. So I often end up doing a lot of retrofitting, which has its challenges. But in that sense, I guess I have worked with people on teams with RCTs and quasi-experimental designs, and also trying to resuscitate or patch up dead designs.
My name is Silvia Nonso. I'm a senior scientist with the International Livestock Research Institute, ILRI, based in Ethiopia. I'm a veterinarian by training, an epidemiologist, so I come from the medical background, although with obviously agriculture professional experience too. I'm relatively new to the field of randomized controlled trials. I've been involved in 2, and one is actually being developed now and about to be launched. It's a complex intervention, so I guess for this one I've been exposed to all the potential challenges that one can have developing an experimental design for a field intervention that is quite complex and with many disciplines and many aspects to look at. So that's the experience I'm bringing in.
Okay. Over to you, the audience. Well, you're too many to introduce your name, so let's do this a bit more pragmatically. Could you raise your hand if you have either conducted a randomized controlled trial as a scientist or been on the implementation side working with scientists doing an RCT? All right, so we have about, I would guess, 30%. And then who in the audience has used evidence from RCTs, read papers or briefs or, that evidence, information that came from RCTs? All right, so everybody has at least some notion of RCTs and their value. That's good. Okay, so how are we going to do this? We prepared some statements that we've discussed with the panel members. We'll show the statement on the screen. We will ask you to kind of use your app, and I don't know exactly how that works, Joe. You will see it in the app? Yeah, all right, it'll magically appear, and then you can either strongly disagree, be neutral, agree, or strongly agree with the statement, and then it will, if all goes well, it will show on the screen. And then we will ask the panel members to do the same, and we'll have a little discussion. So it's the conference app. If you haven't downloaded it yet, you may want to just work with your neighbor on this one. Okay, so let's have, the rule of the game, panel members, is that we want to keep it short and sweet. Everybody's a bit tired. When I walk around in the audience with the microphone, same for you guys, okay? So let's keep this moving fast. So the first statement, this is practice, okay? This has nothing to do with with RCTs. It's just to get, see if you can find the app on your phone. So the first one is, this session will be the best of the conference, okay? So now, is that on the app? Do you see it? Because, no? Is it there? Somebody said yes. I'm not sure this was a good idea. Okay, yes, okay. So, Joe, what's the question? Where do we find it, Joe, in the app? Or maybe ask, some people have found it clearly. Additional resources, that's where it is in the app. People are kind of neutral about the additional resources, that's where it is. Okay. If you're not more positive about this, we're just going to go to coffee break right away. Okay, I think you found where it is, so let's get the real work started. Okay, this is going in the right direction here. People are mostly positive about this panel session. That's good. That's all we need to know. All right, let's start the real work here. The first one is RCTs provide a strong tool to evaluate the effectiveness of ANH programs. ANH stands for Agriculture, Nutrition, and Health, if you hadn't figured that out yet. So go to your app. If all is well, you should be able to vote on this. So RCTs provide a strong tool to evaluate the effectiveness of ANH programs. And you have 5 categories to respond. Okay, okay. The majority of people agree. 80% either agrees or strongly agrees. That's a good point. Okay, now I want to ask the panel members they will use color-coded cards to show whether they strongly agree. Yeah, so if you're like in between, put some white in. So green would be strongly, there's only so many colors of paper that we could get. So yeah, that's budget limitations, you know. So if you strongly agree, show green. If you kind of agree, green and white, you can figure this out, you know. All right, so we have strongly agree, strongly agree, strongly agree, strongly agree. That's kind of boring. All right, let's ask, Grace, why don't you say, give us your opinion about why you strongly agree with the statement?
I think that regardless of whether or not it's an ANH program or not, the RCTs provide an opportunity to separate out a very specific issue that you can test to see whether or not it's effective. And it also provides the confidence in the results that the external person can believe in the results.
Okay. Anybody else wants to comment?
So I think the statement is correct, but the statement also doesn't exclude that there may be other methods that are as appropriate or maybe even more appropriate. And I think it all depends on the type of intervention you are evaluating. Agricultural interventions can be of many types. Technological are very precise. Probably an RCT is very conducive. When there's more fluid interventions, there might be other methods for assessing impact that might be more suitable.
Okay, thank you. Some people disagreed or strongly disagreed, and I didn't kind of, if you are happy to self-identify and want to say 2 words or 2 sentences about why you disagree or strongly disagree, this is your moment. All right. Keep it short.
I use RCT for more medicalized approach, but I think in terms of agriculture, nutrition, and health, the trials should be in a longer run, and I'm not sure how RCT could fit into such a long run trial. It could be difficult, and I think in terms of ANH, we should try to find other tools. So because if we keep on insisting, finding evidence that ANH works, then we'll be like losing in a way against the more medicalized approach.
Okay, so a challenge we hear here is that a lot of these programs run too long to kind of use this tool. Agnes, do you want to say something?
So I want to talk about doing longitudinal follow-ups of things that were originally set up as an RCT. So I was part of the group that followed up a really, I think, famous intervention, the Oriente study in Guatemala, and we came back years later to look at the long-term impact of this intervention on various outcomes related to nutrition in later life and also education and human capital earnings, etc. So you can, in fact, build in a very long longitudinal component to an RCT. But the thing that I wanted to add is that I don't believe in RCTs by themselves really being the answer to every question you want to ask about an ANH program, especially complex intervention.
Let me cut you off there because that's the next statement. Okay. So we'll go there.
Sorry, so I think I wanted to sort of take on what Mulia, whom I just met thanks to Alan Danger's exercise earlier. I do understand your point, but I think the RCT as a design is going to help you ascertain causality. And from that perspective, it is considered as the gold standard. And obviously, if your objective is not to define causality, then yes, there are, you can find other designs. So I think that that's where I would come from. But I also want to add on to Silvia's point that often what you want in an ANH program is not just describe causality or ascertain causality, but you also understand the fidelity of that intervention. And that's where you have very different types of methods that should be used in conjunction with an RCT design. So that would be my addition.
All right, this is a perfect introduction, thank you, to the next statement. Evidence generated by RCTs is so strong that accompanying studies are not necessary. Go to the app, strongly disagree, disagree, neutral, agree, strongly agree. So much focus in this room, it's lovely to see. Okay, so this has flipped compared to the previous question. We have between 80 and 90% of the audience thinks that that is not true. They disagree with that statement. Let's start with the audience this time. Who cares to comment briefly about this statement that evidence generated by RCTs is so strong that you don't need any other evidence? Who wants to comment on that? John.
So I think there's two fundamental problems that we see often in trials. So one is the external validity. You do it in a specific population, it may not be very generalizable. And the other is your intervention may be so specific that it may not fit the problem. And so you've tried a design that's an intervention that's not really that valid yet.
And I saw a very energetic hand somewhere there. Yes, do you see if I can make it?
I don't know if my hand was the energetic one, but my name's Mark from Centre for Food Policy, City University of London. I think there's always room for qualitative inquiry to provide some context, in addition to this quantitative inquiry.
All right, who in the panel would like to comment or start commenting on this statement? Do you have a mic? Oh, you need to vote, sorry, I forgot that. So, so the statement, please vote on this. Do you disagree strongly? So, all right. So the most moderate respondent is Grace, so I'm gonna give her the mic.
Well, I think it depends on the question. So it's not going to be 100% that I would strongly disagree with this, but that on most questions I would expect that additional studies, qualitative studies or different approaches would be needed. But I don't think it's a completely yes or no.
Okay.
Yeah, I think one of the things when you gave us the statements, Jeff, earlier this week, I kept thinking about it and I said, the one thing that I have learned in planning the few RCTs or quasi-experimental studies I've done is that you really, really need to spend the time in preparing and defining your objective and your research question very, very clearly. And that's going to drive the decision-making on your design and the methods that you want to use. And I think that just using an RCT to answer a question is not the way out. If it is the right question and that would be the design to answer that question, then you use that.
Okay.
That would be my...
How do you define the right question?
Oh.
What's your definition of the right question? Can you expand a bit on that?
No, because you didn't challenge us that way.
We have this stand already. Anybody else on the panel wants to comment?
So it depends also on the topic that you're looking at. But for example, in my area, where I'm looking at gender dynamics and empowerment impacts of complex interventions, I want to understand how and why the intervention worked. And very often we may not understand exactly how the interventions affect the inter-household dynamics, for example, just by looking at what we get from the RCT.
So Agnes, before you pass on the mic, could you give us an example of where accompanying studies, so you had an RCT, other studies were added where that led to insights that you may not have had if you hadn't done the additional work? Or maybe anybody else on the panel, if you have an example that comes to mind?
I could. So we just finished RCT. That was an integrated project for agriculture and nutrition. And one of the questions that remained was, what were the implications for women's time? And so we added an additional study to go in and look at time allocation.
Okay, anybody else wants to comment on this? Any final strong opinions that you need to, Alan, It's not your time yet, but you can certainly say something. But it's going to eat into the minute you have at the end.
No one. No one's said the words process evaluation, so I just wanted to say them because clearly, that's critical. That's what we're talking about here. Understanding how you give an intervention and then you measure it at the end. You have a result, but that's all you've got. You don't understand how. And that process evaluation is the critical. So collecting information along the way, those qualitative studies, the smaller scale studies to understand how the intervention worked is absolutely critical.
Hi, I'm Sunita Karyala. So I think when we're thinking of agri-nutrition interventions, probably several of us are thinking about something doing on the farm, and can we then RCT it, and then can we use process evaluation, so on and so forth. But if you're really thinking of, I'm going to change my production system, the government has put something in place so that the water footprint is, I don't know, optimal, whatever Fran would call it. Or one of the studies we are doing is on markets. Can markets be nutrition sensitive? And we are doing one of those studies, and it's not an RCT because there are several other questions behind that, beyond a subsistence question at the farm level, which might be difficult to RCT and get to the causality. And that's where I think the contention is, I suppose, on how do we then go about it, and what is the credibility of those designs vis-a-vis, RCTs.
Okay, so this comment relates in a sense a bit more to the first one. There are interventions and programs we implement where an RCT is simply not possible, and how do you go about designing studies that still give you credible evidence? Anybody else in the audience? Carol?
Yeah, Carol Levin from University of Washington. I wanted to point out that because we believe RCTs are the gold standard, and so, for instance, if we look at the same question in different country settings, we may identify that the intervention is effective in reducing, let's say, child mortality, if that's what we're interested in. But without understanding the information from a process evaluation, we don't know about fidelity, we don't know about how it was implemented. So the example is there were years ago a number of very good studies looking at community health worker effect on child mortality, and they were done in several different country settings. But I think, as all of us know, there are big differences in a community health volunteer. There are a lot of different individual characteristics which are hard to quantify. They are supplied with different things. So just looking at, does CHW reduce child mortality? You might have evidence that it does, but it really won't help you to design, I think, the next intervention or scale it up. So,
thank you. So what I've heard is that RCTs are a strong design, but if you don't add additional study components, process evaluations, possibly qualitative work to understand the how and the why and what's needed to scale up, you basically generate information and evidence that's not terribly useful. Okay, lovely. No major disagreement yet. Let's see what the next one brings. We're going a bit more technical now. Registering your ANH trial is a good idea, but it's not necessary. Okay, and if you're a bit confused by this statement, don't vote yet, okay? Because I want to turn to the panel members if somebody could explain what that means, registering your trial. Who volunteers? Shibani.
So in nutrition science, whether you're doing a clinical or a community-based study, if you have a primary outcome that is a nutrition outcome, it's now required. It is required for the study team to register with a federal registry, whether it's in the US or in the UK or Europe. There are different registries that you have to essentially register your trial. And it's essentially, you go to a website and you fill in the details of your protocol, particularly identifying your hypothesis, your objectives, your research question, the methods, location, what your primary outcome is, what your secondary outcomes are, and so on and so forth. And this gets reviewed and you get assigned a registration number. And most journals where you would want to publish an evaluation focused on nutrition or medical outcomes or health outcomes require you to have that registration ID prior to submission and prior to starting the trial.
Okay, so this is kind of the kind of the technical explication, but kind of stepping back a bit further, why is this something that the nutrition community has come up with? Like, why do we do it? Grace, do you want to comment?
Well, I'm not sure the nutrition community has come up with it.
No, but I mean, in Shibani, you know, other communities obviously have this too. So, yeah.
One of the reasons is ethics. That it opens up research to the population. It shares research and the knowledge about research, as well as the participation, ability to participate, or the chance to participate in research. So I think that's an important part of it, is that these are open public records that people can go on and see what research is going on and who's working on the different fields. The other issue is transparency, that it gives an opportunity to be very clear from the very beginning before you collect a piece of data on what your intentions are and what the intervention is exactly is going to be, and it keeps you honest as to what your analysis is going to be, at least your initial analysis is going to be.
Okay, anybody else on the panel wants to say something?
Yeah, I wanted to follow on that honesty a little bit, because we do a lot of studies, and obviously we don't, I mean, beyond the RCTs, you don't have to register any of it. I think that honesty is about adding credibility to your results. There's a risk, coming from the medical field, the rationale for this is that there's the temptation to use the data and continue analyzing and reanalyzing your data until you find something that is interesting to publish. So by registering and stating a priori what is it that you are trying to look for in this trial avoids any challenges afterwards as to whether this was just found because you really dig into the data until you found something that was worthwhile. So.
Okay, I'll take you in a minute, but I want to see your opinions on this. Maybe you've given it away already. So, yeah, they voted. We'll put the vote up in a second. We don't want to bias you. Okay, so strongly disagree or disagree. I'll come to you in a minute. Could we show the votes again, Joe? This is going surprisingly well. It's amazing. I had nightmares of things going awfully wrong. Okay, so what do we have here? Okay, only 60% disagrees or strongly disagree. So we have people in the room who think that it's kind of optional but not necessary. Or you didn't understand kind of the double negation of the statement. That's another possibility. So if you do not think that if you think that registering a trial is good but not absolutely necessary, and you volunteer to talk about that, raise your hand. Ooh. Okay. We'll, Alan. You only had 10 seconds. You'll have to come closer because you're going to have that awkward noise again.
Two things. Number one, I pressed the wrong button because I couldn't understand the question. So I'm actually one of those strongly agree people, and I'm obviously a strongly disagree person. I didn't read the question. But the second point is I just wanted to pick up on the honesty, transparency point. You made a point at the end there that it's only RCTs that get registered. That's not correct. There are all sorts of study designs that are now registered, and we should all be registering our studies, cross-sectional, longitudinal. You're supposed to register all these things so that there's much greater transparency in the analysis. So it's a relatively new thing, but you know, we need to be much more transparent in how we do science, and the best way to do that is to register your study before you start it.
Thank you. Oh wow, look at that. So I'll help you understand the next statement before you vote. So don't push, don't go too fast. All right. So this is Agnes' time to say something.
So I do want to say something because this is a disciplinary difference. So I think people who are in the nutrition field know the necessity of registration. So I'm an economist, and a lot of my fellow economists like registration, duh. I mean, it's a very new thing for economists to think about registering their trials. So in fact, what has often happened is that, and I know this happens in my workplace, that a trial ends up being registered late, like maybe just before the end line, and not not at baseline, because the economists or the PIs didn't think about it. And so that means that the paper can never be published in a nutrition journal, and believe me, it's a source of constant tension within the group.
Okay.
We don't kill each other, though.
You didn't hear that. We don't kill each other. That was the last statement. Grace and then Shibani. And then I want to go back to the audience because I want to see what kind of backgrounds, disciplinary backgrounds we have, and if we can maybe extract some differences across the domains or the backgrounds in the audience, so start thinking about that. Grace.
I just want to make a slight deviation, if I could, because I think this is important, this issue that we want to work with different disciplines, and we want to bring in people from this. And disciplines have very different ways about going about doing research. And I've had this exact same problem with ethics, in getting ethics and this concept of having to present for ethics before in disciplines that have never done this. So I just wanted to bring this to the attention that when you're working with multiple disciplines, you're going to face these kind of issues, and things that are important for your field need to be talked about from the very beginning.
Shibani?
I was just going to add on that has been one of the issues working across nutrition and agriculture, is a lot of to be left unnamed institutions and research groups in agriculture for a long time didn't actually use institutional review boards. I think it's becoming a lot more common now, and people do have IRBs and reviews of studies. And in nutrition, it's been a standard practice for the past 30 or more years that you have to have an IRB approval to do any human subjects research. So I think that's one of the sort of interdisciplinary differences. And then one more thing I wanted to add was on the issue of registering the trials. And I think there has been, and this sort of comes to the whole issue of guidance, my understanding was until about 5, maybe 7 years ago, at least in the United States, federally supported research had to be registered, and it was only RCTs. And then it's now shifted over, as Alan has said, to pretty much all studies should be registered in the name of transparency and making sure that we're doing science that is open. And I think that shift from going from just RCTs that are federally funded to everything being registered has led to a lot of people in a path of often being rejected by journals. And that's really difficult when you're sort of in that transition mode. So I just wanted to add that caveat to registering.
Okay, I was going to come to you. I will come to you. But I heard something that was a statement, and then we dropped it because we were afraid we would run out of time. Working across disciplines, it's challenging, I hear. Is that a reason not to do it, or
No, absolutely not. I mean, I think I said yesterday that I think it's really important to bring in different disciplines, and we were talking about mental health, for example, yesterday, and the need to bring in people who are experts in mental health. But it is a challenge because we see research very differently, and it takes a lot of face-to-face time with those people to make sure that what you need to happen is not negotiable, and it actually does have to happen, like ethics.
Yeah. Do you want to comment?
Yes.
I knew it.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely necessary. And I think when you cross the boundaries of the disciplines, that's where the innovation happens in the methodologies, in the way of addressing things. I think something we have to work more on across disciplines is increasing trust. We really see, someone coming from another discipline, and whatever they are proposing is not as sound, is not as rigorous, is not as solid as what, coming from our discipline. So we have to really work on building trust across disciplines, and then increasing practice, because that will bring up new methods that will work in this space.
Okay, so remarkable that we all use RCTs, which is at its very core a simple approach. You randomly assign people to different groups, that there is disagreement on how to do this well across disciplines. So I know a little bit about the nutrition field and a little bit about the health field, but I wanted to know if anybody from, well, maybe Robin from the ag field can comment on how registration, and so my question would be, well, you weren't expecting a question, were you? So registration and then your view on collaboration across disciplines.
Happy to support the notion that registering the trial is important.
How common is that in your field?
It depends on the strength of the nutritionist that you're collaborating with and how well they insist.
I like that.
Yes, so, and I think when you bring people together from different backgrounds, it is really hard work. And on the animal health side, I think we need to learn from public health. In public health, if you're in many places where you submit your proposal, your key leaders have to show that they've had training in human ethics. I think the animal health people need to step up, and I would think that anyone who is going to be implementing a project focusing on animal source food should also have done training in animal ethics. And the idea of distributing animals into an area, possibly breeds that weren't there before, to do that without having an adequate animal health services in place could become an animal welfare issue.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else from, you know who you are, people who are agronomists and have worked with nutritionists or health experts or economists, care to comment? Alessandra, you're not.
Yeah. Can I comment anyway?
Yes, you can.
Thank you. So I'm Alessandra Gallienda. I work as a gender scientist at ILRI. I just wanted to share an experience that we had with the More Milk project. So I do qualitative work only, and maybe because the whole thing about registering and ethical approvals comes from a different discipline, I think we've had a few issues with the ethical approval. So I do a lot of exploratory work. So we go in before sometimes the project starts, just to try and understand what do people think about this issue, what are the relevant points, what really matters here. And for us, we go there with an open mind. We start asking questions, and then slowly, as we analyze the data and we go more in detail, new issues come up. And sometimes we have to verify, oh, there seems to be a particular pattern here, and we want to go back and ask again, is this actually what you meant, and is it relevant? And despite the fact that I really appreciate anonymity of the respondents, last time we wanted to go back and ask people, excuse me, to clarify some issues, and the whole protocol was so anonymous. We had no way of going back and identifying them. It's like, oh my goodness, you know, it's like, okay, we invested so much money and energy, and now we can't validate it. So my point is, I think we also need to develop a bit more the protocols to allow also for, you know, maybe some flexibility depending on what discipline you're in, what study you're trying to do.
Thank you. So perspective from someone, I love to hear all of you, but I want somebody who is an agronomist, like core agronomist, to comment on this point. John?
Well, I work with agronomists and I work with health people, so I have this kind of interdisciplinary. The point, I think, one of the points is that a lot of the agronomy research is weak when it comes to studies about comparisons. And it's more a faith-based exercise than it is a rigorous scientific exercise. And that's why it's so important to register, because we have to, that's the stage, that early stage where people really have to say, here's the outcome, this is what I want to do, this is how I'm going to do it, and it gets challenged is critical. So I think that's important. One thing I haven't heard is the whole reason why these registries started in the first place from the health community. And it's a very important reason. There was all kinds of drug trials done, and we made decisions about what drugs got registered, but there was a huge publication bias where the drugs, when the trials that didn't work didn't get published, and so we had a very skewed idea of what happened. So this is the origin of registration, was that all the things that didn't work, we never knew about them. One of my concerns is we don't use these registries properly to actually learn more from them than we have.
Okay, that's a good point. I'll take one more, but if you can be brief, that would be appreciated. So, oh, you have the mic already. Perfect.
Hi, this is Tulika Narayan from Apt Associates. So I guess my point is sort of, you're talking about interdisciplinary IRB, and APT does a lot of research. We have an institutional review board to review studies across health, agriculture. But I wonder, and I think maybe this is what, John, you're getting to, IRB applies only when you're doing research, but there are many more millions of dollars being spent in actually implementing programs. And there isn't a review, an ethical review of, are you implementing in the field with an intervention which has an evidence of having an impact? And I think that's an area where we really need to move forward, because we have the ability, we know how it works, and I think we're trying to begin that conversation in app because we do research and implementation. But I think this is a giant gap, because we actually touch hundreds and thousands of smallholders with interventions, or in households with interventions with necessarily no evidence of them actually working. And you're sort of doing implicit trials without actually recognizing them as that.
Okay, thank you. That might be...
Could I just respond a little bit to that?
Oh my God, this is getting out of hand now. So Hung can, I know he can be very brief, so I'll give him the mic, and then we'll take it back, because we have a lot more interesting statements coming.
I will be very brief. I just want to raise one point. In our research in developing countries, we talked a lot about nutrition. Here we are talking about health and other things also. And so for the One Health research we are conducting between the medical and vet and agricultural people, I think that I value very much the interdisciplinary research for that. But one of the needs we have, and I come back to the Robin side, is in fact most of the public health research we need to go through the ethical clearance process. And now for some of the donors, they request also the clearance for the animal ethics research. And in most of the country we are working, we don't have this ethical committee for animal research. And this is something that we need to, some international organization need to help developing countries to develop this kind of thing. So for example, ILRI, we are helping Vietnam Research Institute of Veterinary Research to do this kind of thing. And some of the donors, they really need that. And I think that we try to support the developing countries to do so.
Thank you very much. Let's bring it back to the RCT. So on the implementation, that's a good point. Maybe for next year's panel, we have a volunteer already to moderate. So let's bring it back to RCTs, if that's okay. So you have one panel member already for next year too. So
can I make a comment? It's RCT related.
Sure.
Yeah. So I think, well, RCT and in general research related. So one of the things we are facing right now at this moment, we have Tufts University legal teams talking with one of our partner institutions that's based in Europe over data privacy laws. And I think that that's one of the things that we are now realizing, that not just IRB registration, but which could be different country by country, but the sharing of data between European countries and North America is going to require a different process. And it was a bit of a shock. We have been trying to get this partner on board for 6 months, and we are all set. We're all set with everything on the protocol side. We've submitted to IRB, but we don't have a subcontract with our implementer because of the difference in the data privacy laws between the United States and the European Union. So I just want to point out to you that that's something, when you're talking interdisciplinary, you also have to think about where your partners are located relative to the laws and the sort of ethics requirements of those countries.
Wonderful. As if things weren't complex enough already, you know? Bring it on. This is your chance. Okay, next statement. RCTs in agriculture, nutrition, and health should just have one primary outcome. And again, if this state, Alan, I'll explain this to you in a second, so don't vote yet. If this is a bit confusing, primary outcome, if you don't do these regularly, or let's go to a panel member to quickly explain what that means, a primary and a secondary outcome. Who volunteers to say a word or two about that?
Well, when you register, that's exactly what they ask. They ask you for one primary outcome, and then you can have your secondary outcomes. But it's going to be the specific outcome of what you're looking at that you've actually done your sample size for, and is the one that you're going to talk about causality.
Can you give an example of a trial you're working on right now, like what you do, what the primary outcome is, and what the secondary outcomes would be? I mean, not all of them.
Right. Okay, so the last one we did, the Nutrition Links project, was an integrated agriculture nutrition project where the primary outcome was height for age or anthropometric outcomes. The secondary outcomes would be the diet, the knowledge, the egg production, things like that.
Okay, good. Is that clear? Anybody still very confused about primary outcomes? Do we need more background? Are you confused, Carol?
Is it just a semantics thing? I mean, you can look at as many outcomes as you like, but you can only call one of them a primary one, and then the rest secondary?
Oh, no, no, no. You can have many primary outcomes. That's where the confusion is. So, yeah, as if, likewise, you can have many flagships in A4NH, for instance. Things are not always what they appear to be.
Could you fool the system is what I'm asking. I'm a little confused between what the system allows you to do.
So when you register, I think when you say system, it's the trial registry, like clinicaltrials.gov is one of them. You can actually put more than one primary outcome in there. And when you look, there are studies that have one, and there are studies that have 2, 3, and many more. So the term, anyway, there seems to be some confusion. That's what we want. Well, we don't want confusion, but that's why we have the statement. So why don't you just vote, and we'll see where this goes, or what you think.
But it's going to be tied on whether or not you did the sample size.
Say that again?
It's going to be tied on whether or not you did the sample size.
Yeah, so important point
that
Grace raised is like the outcome that you're going to make causal claims about. That's one thing you said. And the second one, this is the one you power the study for. So you do your sample size calculations on.
So, and actually just to, you can have multiple primary outcomes for certain conditions where some disorders, for instance, are multifaceted. So your intervention might be targeting alleviation of a disorder. And
I'm going to cut you off there because that's the discussion. So
oh, okay.
I'll come back to you.
I think that might help Carol with the next set of statements.
Have you voted this? Joe? It's getting more interesting, more uniform distributions, not as skewed. I think half of the audience is not voting. Are you asleep, or you wish you were somewhere else and don't dare walking out because the light is on? All right, so I think it's shifted to disagreement, but not in a very strong fashion. So I would like to hear, we'll start with the panel first. Okay, because I heard some disagreement already. Grace was saying, oh yes, thank you. So yes, vote. So you strongly disagree that you should only have one primary outcome, okay? Oh, come on, I was waiting for some fireworks here. You kind of all converging to, you gotta choose, Shibani, okay? If you're neutral, it's just white. Choose. No. First, no. Vote. Okay, so they all disagree in a somewhat moderate fashion. Okay. Grace and Shibani, there seemed to be some disagreement between the two of you. No?
No, I'm only kind of somewhat disagreeing because I think there are circumstances where one is fine and there are other circumstances where you're going to have more. I just think it has to be powered. So whatever you do, you need to make sure that you have sufficient sample. And if you have 5 primary outcomes, they've got to have sample size calculations done for each of those.
Okay, Shibani?
Yeah, and I think, and I might be giving your next statement away, but there are statistical considerations when you have more than one outcome, primary outcome. And so I'm not going to say anything more because you're looking at me.
No, don't do it because you're killing the rest of
So I think
the panel.
Adding to Grace's point that you have to power your study not just for that one outcome measure if you're looking at multiple outcomes. You also should look at secondary outcome power calculations, frankly, but that's different discussion. But yeah, so I'm kind of on the neutral to disagree end because it really depends on your research question. I'll keep coming back to that.
The typical PhD response, it depends. Audience, who wants to comment? If you strongly agree or disagree, this is your chance to make it known to the world why that is the case. Yes?
Because I have registered 2 primary outcomes, and of course it needs to be powered. The idea of declaring a primary outcome is to again, be accountable to why you're doing what you're doing. You can have 3 if you're powered. I don't know if I can have 3. I have 2, so that I can confirm. So I don't know where the question is coming from in terms of just one primary outcome. You seem to agree that that's the standard. But no? Okay, yeah. So you can have 2 if you, as long as you have power for it.
So you said you can have 2 if you have power. You're not sure if you can have 3. We don't know how far we can go.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a good summary statement. All right. We haven't heard from you. Oh, take that mic so I can keep walking around. I think it's on.
I think the ag nutrition interventions are broad-based, and there is likelihood of affecting multiple outcomes, and it would be a waste of resources if we have just one primary outcome. And in terms of power calculations, it can be done for the primary outcomes more than one, and I think that a higher sample size should be used so that you can cover more than one outcomes.
Okay, but that's an interesting point. Efficiency. You know, if you're going to spend money on a study, how many outcomes do you want to make conclusions about, draw conclusions about? That's not something that had come out of the panel, but that's a very important point you bring up. Anybody else? I seem to be focusing on the right side of the room. Left people here, you must have opinions too. Yes, in the very back.
I agree that there can be more than one primary outcomes. While I was in Nutrition International, we did a study on understanding complementary feeding and exclusive feeding, breastfeeding, and we powered both the primary indicators, and that worked very well. So there can be more than primary.
So how many did you have?
2 primary outcomes.
2 primary outcomes,
yeah.
Just like Sunita. 2 is okay, 3 might be too many. You're not the expert, okay. Oh, she doesn't run the registry. Okay. Who else went to, the lady here? You can use my mic and I'll wait for another one.
Yeah, in one of our adolescent study, we have 3 primary outcomes.
Oh, you crossed the line. We're at 3 now. Who can do more? Come on. It's exciting.
Yeah.
I like this. I like this a lot. Who has done more than 3 and wants to talk about it? You? No? Or you want to say something? Yes, the mic is behind you.
Well, I think this is a question where that the RCT is born out of medical research, and this is where you really focus on one primary outcome. So where we are in our field, we are a bit more explorative, so there should be room for more primary outcomes, but just not to be tempted to put a lot of primary outcomes is that more and more journals will require that you report all your primary outcomes in one publication, so you're not allowed to split it up in different publications. So this is just a warning that you are not tempted to to overload your protocol with primary outcomes.
Okay, I hear 2 very important points that had not been brought up. The first one, well, the last one you mentioned is publication, okay. The other term you used was exploratory. So when we make causal inferences, we consider that a confirmatory study, but you said exploratory. So where do we draw the line between exploratory and confirmatory when it comes to primary and secondary outcomes? That's another important. I'll take 1 or 2 more from the audience. John, do you want to say it? You started laughing.
Yeah, I just started laughing because these become exploratory when the confirmation doesn't work.
Okay, he's confusing everybody now. Okay, you wanted to say something, and then I can take 1 more.
Yeah, so the way that we've been working with say, ag results, which we are evaluating, is sort of defining the outcomes in different domains, because especially when you have an intervention that's affecting agricultural outcomes, or there are emissions-related outcomes. So they're just completely different domains where the program is expecting to have an impact, and the primary is usually defined as the one that is your final outcome, and everything is secondary or exploratory, that is sort of the intermediate, logic leading up to it. So those domains come to the rescue, and if there are more domains to what the project is trying to do, then you cross the line, 3, 4,
4. You said 4.
Well, I don't have 4, but I just
It's on-
wanted
it's
to.
being recorded,
I just wanted
you know.
to say that it shouldn't be out of the
Okay.
realm of possibility.
If you have multiple domains, you can cross the line to 4. That's the summary statement. Okay, and you can. Okay, hold on. Mr. Noor can make a very quick comment.
Yes, I wanted to quickly ask, in agriculture, health and nutrition, do trials always have to be expensive? Or do you also see scope for, speak about efficiency, for more junior researcher friendly trials like information treatments, behavioral lab experiments, and those kinds of things?
Very good point, but I want to kind of park it because we want to kind of continue to focus. I think there is definitely scope for that, but since we're talking about randomized trials, I just want to keep the discussion focused on that for now. Sorry to not take your question at this point. Alan, do you want to come here?
Just to say, so CONSORT, as for those of you, I'm sure all of you will know, CONSORT is the guidance for the design and reporting of trials. Yeah? And it's been set up for some time, since 2010, and so when you, well, the 2010 CONSORT statement is the latest one. And I'll read what it says about primary outcomes. The primary outcome measure is the pre-specified outcome considered to be of greatest importance to relevant stakeholders, such as patients, policymakers, clinicians, funders, and is usually the one used in the sample size calculation. Some trials have more than one primary outcome. Having several primary outcomes, however, incurs the problems of interpretation associated with multiplicity of analysis and is not recommended.
That sounded like the sermon on Sunday in church.
Yeah, so Jeff.
Okay, I want to go to the panel, and then we'll go, because we're starting to lead into the next statement here, because you said multiplicity.
Right, I know, that's why. I've been holding my tongue, Alan.
No, don't talk about multiplicity yet. You'll get your chance. Anybody else from the panel wants to comment on this very thing? Yes.
Something that I think hasn't been mentioned. We had an experience where we were designing a trial with two primary outcomes, and they were quite distinct, and different disciplines within the team were interested on different one of them. And the issue was raised that one was most likely to be impacted than the other one. And there was a bit of fear that if we had two and then one was not successful, everyone would look at the intervention thinking it was not successful, even though it impacted on the other one. So obviously those coming from the discipline of that outcome, they said this is a waste of resources. We'd rather go for the one we are more likely to impact and put all our power, our energy on that one and leave the other one as exploratory or secondary outcome. So again, this is not the way we decided to go on, but it's also about that, how do we then interpret our results at the very end if we have multiple primary outcomes becomes relevant, if we want to have an intervention that we want to say, does it work or not in agriculture for nutrition and health?
Okay, very good point. When do we declare an intervention a success, you know, and does the choice of primary outcomes affect that kind of general conclusion? Okay, time to move to the next one. Trials with multiple arms and multiple outcomes need to adjust for multiple comparisons. Okay, again, if this statement is confusing, we'll ask the panel. I think Shibani, this is your chance. You can talk now.
Every time I look at that previous statement, it's so linked to this whole issue of multiple outcomes. So I think as Alan pointed out, the problem is if your outcomes are correlated, you will have serious issues in interpretation, and you might actually conclude impact on an intervention when in fact, especially if you haven't adjusted statistically. And there are methods you can use to adjust statistically for multiple outcomes, and therefore it's really recommended not to
But before you say that there are what is the basic problem?
Because you might have, you have to understand if your primary outcomes are correlated, and so you're going to maybe have a higher rate of false positive.
Okay, so if you look at many different things, the odds of finding something that's significant go up.
Exactly, go up.
Okay.
The odds of, exactly, thank you.
Okay, anybody else wants to talk about the definition of this very statement? I'll come to you, ask about your opinion if I don't forget, because I seem to forget about the panel. All right, vote, please. Are people voting, Joe? Can you show us the results? No. Joe, no, can you stand up? Nobody can see you. Joe is doing all the hard work here, literally behind the screen. A quick round of applause, you know? Okay, let's look at what we have here. So, people agree in the audience. What do we, 60, 59 plus 24, what is that? 84%? Oh, Sunita, you voted wrong again? Oh, okay. Yeah, London School, they have their own set of challenges, it looks like. Okay, very interesting. Who in the audience who voted disagree? We have very few. Ed, I knew it.
So you want to know why I disagreed?
Yeah.
Well, as it's stated, it's like a blanket statement, and I think it depends. And there's two things.
PhD response.
There's two things embedded in there. One is multiple arms. I mean, R.A. Fisher invented the analysis of variance about 85 years ago because he thought, why would we test only one thing at a time and make all that effort when we can test many things at the same time? It's much more efficient. And then there evolved a way of thinking about planned comparisons that were sort of legal and fit within our way of thinking about what's allowable to be tested. And so we should be going to that first. The issue about multiple outcomes is a different issue, completely different issue, which, you know, we had a further discussion about, a discussion about it just earlier. And again, I think that depends, as I was talking with Jeff earlier today, even the thinking about multiplicity for outcomes is actually a mess. And there's a lot of thought that needs to be given to how to straighten that out. I think the major issue we face is that, and this goes back to Alan reading the consort statement, which is we don't want to design and implement and analyze our trials as if they're drug trials, because they're not. And the consort statement is driven by the need to get a control over drug trials. And so it's important we're having this discussion.
Okay. I'm going to take somebody else first. Yes.
Hello. I hope I'm not reaching too much beyond my expertise, but I can see exceptions to this when you might have outcomes that you have strong reason to believe that they wouldn't sort of interfere with each other. So for example, in a multidisciplinary trial, if you think that your outcome could have a health outcome, but also maybe like a carbon capture outcome, and you have no reason to believe that somebody's change in diet, let's say, will change like the carbon in the atmosphere, then I can kind of see how you could potentially have exceptions.
Okay, so the independence of pathways to impact or the independence of the outcomes, and those are obviously related, may impact that decision. I want to ask the panel members' opinion. Trials with multiple arms and multiple outcomes need to be adjusted for multiple comparisons. Can you show your caller cards? Finally, we get some action on the podium here. All right, so Grace, you were the outlier here, in a good way, you know.
I agree with Ed, and I don't know that I have that much more to add than what he said. I think it depends very much on what you're doing, and there are going to be times where there is too much closeness of the outcomes that is going to be problematic, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there is a problem. And if you've done the sample size calculations for your outcomes, I don't see the problem.
Okay, Agnes, or okay, yes, you can.
I think so from my perspective, the statement, and to Ed's point, has multiple things happening to it, multiple arms, multiple outcomes, multiple comparisons. And so I think there are different things you can say if you had separated out. But I think in general, my view is that you do need to adjust, particularly since you could be generating bias. And and I don't think it's not that you can't do this, but I think you need to make sure that you're talking to a very good statistician when you're planning and designing your study so that you can, and analytical strategy should be something you should be thinking about in the design phases. So that's my reason to say I agree, but there are sort of lots of different considerations within this.
Silvia, very quickly, because I want to make sure. Did you want to say something? Okay, that's fine. That's even quicker then. Okay, next and final statement. Okay, clear guidance on how to conduct rigorous agriculture, nutrition, and health RCTs is easy to find. Clear guidance is easy to find. Okay, you're voting. I want to the panel members to tell us right now what they think. Do they agree, disagree? Okay. Grace, wonderful. I think she wants coffee. She wants to, you know. Joe, can we see the results? Nobody's voting? Oh. Okay, votes are coming in. I'll come to the audience. Grace, I would like to ask you.
Well, it probably depends on where you are and what access you have to resources. But I think there's an enormous amount of material out there about RCTs. There's an enormous number of studies now published and a lot of professionals out there. So I think there is access to it. Probably if you are in a country that has very poor internet, it might be more challenging. But I think there's a lot of information out there.
Silvia, not only did you show the red, your face was also kind of showing red.
Very
so.
red. No, I think at least my experience has been that it's really hard to navigate this space, especially because of this transdisciplinarity. And people have all different references as to what constitute clear guidelines for RCTs. From the medical field, I think those are very clear and strong. Now, when you move into agriculture, nutrition, and health research, then it's a bit more shaky space, and there's areas where you really don't know what applies, what doesn't, yeah, what is relevant.
Okay, I want to go to people who felt as red as Silvia did to quickly comment because we have to wrap up soon. So people who think that clear guidance is hard to find, that you're kind of, you want to do a good job and it's hard to find guidance on how to do that. People are really thinking about coffee right now. All right, well, thanks for your contributions, audience. We'll go to Shibani.
Yeah, so I think I actually said disagree because there isn't any guidance, unlike the consort, which is driving the medical field, and to a certain extent nutritionists use the consort. So I think that's where I was sort of saying disagree, but there is a lot of literature out there. So you have to, I think the idea is you have to step out of your comfort zone and look at the other disciplines that are implementing RCTs, because it is a methodological approach, and that you will find literature. But yeah, there isn't a specific sort of guidance. And
Agnes?
so I'm sort of between Silvia and Grace on this one.
Agnes, quickly, if you can.
Yeah, so what I'll say about, there is guidance in theory, like what is done, what is there sort of to do it well in your professional field, but sometimes guidance will butt heads with the practicality, especially if you're designing a trial, say with a government agency which is trying to test various agriculture extension or nutrition BCC interventions, and you have to deal with what's happening in the field. And I think where guidance meets reality, then that's where the challenge is.
Okay, thank you. We had one person who wanted to comment from you. Yes.
Slightly relevant, but perhaps not so much. But I thought you were wrapping up, so I wanted to make the comment. So last week I happened to be at a workshop that brought together a lot of NGOs in India that are many times the implementing agencies for the RCTs, and the entire discussion was about impact evaluation. And while and an overwhelming majority of the people in that room had many concerns about the ethics of RCT from an implementer's perspective and from the people that it's impacting. And so if the program is not well designed, this can really have very negative consequences for the people doing it on the field who have built trust among these communities for many, many years. And obviously the incentives don't always align. For a researcher, rigorous results are more important, but for communities this might not be the case. So I just hope that's something that will be for future conversation.
Thank you for bringing that up, the ethics of implementing programs and interventions. All right, wonderful. Thank you so much. So before we all go to coffee, we have the 3 people in the audience that I asked to kind of highlight one salient point they heard about. So if I can ask them to be very brief, because we only have about a half a minute left. Ed, do you want to start? Or Will? You have the mic. Go ahead.
Sure, yeah. So I think a lot of this comes down to Silvia's concern about, do we have trust? Do our audiences trust us? I want to flag one resource to build trust. If you're doing work with observational data, cross-sectional studies and so forth, and you'd like to pre-register your trial, your study, there is a website called aspredicted.org. So it's quite memorable, As Predicted, a place simply to register your prediction. It's very simple to use, it's very effective. And then trying to build trust through mechanisms that are very, very expensive to do has just raised the cost of research in ways that make it extremely difficult to us to operate. So I hope we don't go overboard on mistrust and try to trust each other through understanding the language we use, the tools we use, and the ANH Academy has been a really good way to build trust, I think, and answer your concern.
Thank you. Ed?
Just one quick comment before I make my main point. With regard to testing for multiplicity, I would be happiest if we never tested for multiplicity, never made those adjustments, because it would mean we've planned well, declared what we're going to do, and including choosing the right primary outcomes. One of the comments made early on by a panel member was that RCTs help establish causality, which really caught my attention. That's a really intriguing statement. Evaluation is about making a judgment. It's about determining the worth of something, in this case, the worth of a program of some sort. And we often talk about that as impact evaluation, but that's not right. Impact is only about what happened. It's about whether this group that had the program is different than the group that didn't, and if the counterfactual is good, then we can make a conclusion about that. But it really doesn't tell us about, as somebody said, how it happened, why it happened, did it reach the people it should have, and was it worth the cost that we had to pay to do it? And those are all part of making a determination about whether something's worthwhile. So RCTs are helpful, but they are only giving us a part of the information we need to make the judgment that we're trying to make.
Thank you very much. Alan, can you not be close to the speaker? You're not going to read the concert again, right?
I'm going to read out your first statement, which was, RCTs provide a strong tool to evaluate the effectiveness of ANH programs. So I'd like to edit that to well-designed RCTs with additional process studies provide a strong tool to evaluate the effectiveness of ANH programs. And I think that's critical. So we've been talking a lot about design and analysis. And that requires thought and lots of careful thought and lots of formative work and lots of all of that. And that requires working with other people who understand all of that. And it requires working with trialists who understand how to design good trials. I think Ed made a very good point earlier about Consort, which was that Consort was designed for reporting, transparently reporting drug trials. And maybe there's a big role for us to play as a community to think about, to actually design, to provide those reporting guidelines, to provide those design guidelines for trials in ANH. Because there are requirements that are different from drug trials, and we've discussed many of them here. The analysis might be the same, but the design might be different, and it's worth thinking about it. And there's space for innovation, there's space for evolution, and there's space for design, new ways of thinking about design and analysis of RCT. So that's what I wanted to say.
Thank you. So, thank you so much to you for making this a success. You were excellent as an audience this morning. I want to thank the panel members for volunteering to do this, to discuss the statements beforehand, to think about them, to formulate opinions, to show the colors. Thank you to Joe. Please stand up again, Joe, for making it all work.